Hello, and welcome to the webinar, 100 Days of Disruption, Trump's Impact on Global Innovation. My name is Anthony Schiavo, Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm going to be joined by a handful of my colleagues, Chris Robinson, Senior Director, Tiffany Hua, Analyst, Ian Reinhardt, Associate Research Director, and Josh Haslam, Senior Research Director here at Lux. They represent a diverse set of the viewpoints and industries here at Lux Research. Throughout this webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll try and answer all the questions, but if your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is still strong. And with that, I want to jump into the presentation. It's been just about 100 days, 102 days, I believe, since Donald Trump took office. And in this presentation, we're not going to be focusing on what he's been up to. We've written a lot of research on the various details of his policy. You can check that out on the member site. Today, we're just going to review a few key themes of his first 100 days, and then get into sector-specific impacts, with the goal of really taking a longer term and a nearer term view on what is going to happen in the future and how innovators need to respond. So with that, let's jump into some of the introduction and the key themes. I think the first big key theme is deglobalization and regionalization. Whether it's the tariffs really prompting a very stark China-US decoupling, or sort of antagonism towards the EU on issues of national defense, which was a major story before the tariffs. Trump has really pushed deglobalization to a new level. I think this is something that at Lux we were a little skeptical about, maybe over the last decade or so, as these rumblings began to enter mainstream discourse. But now it's very clear that we're moving towards a much more regionalized and deglobalized era, especially as countries like Canada are intent on focusing and developing their own regional blocks without the US. Secondly, economic uncertainty has been the dominant theme. Whether it's Trump's economic policies, for example, his pressure on the Fed to cut interest rates, or his more direct actions like the freeze of the IRA funding and the various elements of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. All of this has created a really huge sentiment of volatility, and it has dampened investment, right? It's made it really challenging for companies to invest in especially early stage innovations. And there's been a real shift, a market shift away from sustainability and towards core markets and core performance drivers. Part of this is due to regulations, changes in policy at the EPA, the rollback of the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's also due to, in no small part, to lawsuits. The lawsuits, many of which were underway before the Trump administration took office, and that were likely to succeed even in a second Biden administration. So there's been a lot of pressure on sustainability, even though consumer sentiment has, in our view, held up pretty well. Shareholder pressure has increased. Shareholders want their companies to focus on near-term results, and so a shift away from sustainability has definitely been occurring. And the way we're thinking about Trump right now, you may have heard in the first term with Trump the expression, take him seriously, but not literally. The idea being that Trump's words were representative of a big picture desire or an ambition, but would not really make it into policy. But in the second administration, I think we've seen that Trump has decided to and has been able to make good on many of his campaign promises or pledges. The tariffs, for example, which caught so many off guard, were pretty well broadcast, right? You see this reporting from January that made it very clear they were trying to do this. So we're taking Trump seriously and literally. And we're expecting that he's going to continue to act on many of his campaign priorities, even though some of them are unusual, unprecedented, or potentially disruptive. So with that, I want to now turn to my colleagues, and I'm going to start with my colleague, Chris Robinson, who leads up our energy research. Chris, why don't you talk to us about the energy sector?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony, for teeing us off. The energy sector, I would say broadly, if there was one message I had for everyone on the line in the energy industry, it's really don't overcorrect and abandon some of the strategic initiatives that you had before the administration. But it's really important to think about how you might adjust tactics with how you're executing along that strategy. If we first look at oil and gas, carbon management divisions, I think are the best example of this, where many oil and gas companies were branching outside their core business, forming business units to do carbon management for other firms and other industries. So capture, move, and ultimately sequester, utilize the carbon dioxide. We're seeing a shift where I think the developers of those business units are a little bit less focused on heavy industry, which is seeing some longer timelines and pushing back some of their decarbonization initiatives, and instead focusing on data centers, which is near term, a very large and significant amount of electricity growth demand predicted from it, with an urgent need for low carbon electricity. So they've found an application for carbon capture that today is much more near term to revenues. And I think the other thing that we've been hearing a lot from our client base and conversations we're having with innovators in the energy industry is that there is a noticeable uptick in interest in on-site power generation, and also thinking about providing flexibility with that. For electricity utilities, I think the time is now to really think about grid flexibility. You have a lot of EVs coming online, and focusing on enhancing grid flexibility by leveraging assets at the grid edge is something that will have benefits today and have lasting benefits on a long-term basis as well. Now, if we think a little bit more long-term, so things that we can do today that have a long-term impact, I have a couple of maybe not obvious things. One being it might be time to invest in hydrogen. And I know what you're thinking. Everyone's kind of getting away from hydrogen. We're seeing a lot of electrolysis projects fail to move through the FID process. But I actually think that there's a silver lining here, which is as we feel more and more confident that today's electrolyzers are probably not able to offer hydrogen at the economics that many users and consumers of hydrogen need, there is a next crop of startups to think about. Things like membraneless electrolysis, thermochemical water splitting that are early stage, but could actually lower those costs of producing hydrogen into somewhere that would be relevant for a lot of consumers of hydrogen. So looking at investing in startups right now that might be able to pay off in the 2030s by giving you a good position in the electrolysis space is how I might approach that long-term opportunity. And on the utility side, I think there are options to pick from, but the one that really comes front of mind is congestion. Basically, every study we've seen and done ourselves that looks at transmission congestion finds that most regions are going to experience increasing levels of grid congestion. And we also know that finding new rights of way to build new transmission lines on is also incredibly challenging, with a lot of consumers and residents pushing back against building of that infrastructure. So basically look at your infrastructure, deploy things like dynamic line ratings that get you more capacity through existing lines, and consider starting to pilot things like high temperature superconductors or other types of advanced conductors as a way to get more through existing lines. Something that, again, does have benefits today, but the real payoff will actually be down the road, looking longer term as we continue seeing load growth and more intermittent variable renewables added to the grid. So that's a quick look at the energy space. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ian, to look at the industrial space.
Thanks, Chris. So for the industrial sector, the near term, I'd like to highlight two themes, and that's the supply chain and opportunities in AI. When it comes to the shifts from Trump's tariffs, the doing, undoing, on again, off again, there's not a lot of joy. It's mostly pain. And that's because this trend of especially US and China decoupling seems to be getting stronger and stronger, which is going to ripple through the entire global trading system. Recently, Lux introduced the raw materials criticality framework. I did a webinar last month, so I don't want to say too much about it right now. You can see that the theme there was risk and criticality. but we've developed a relatively simple way for companies to quickly assess the political risk to their supply and supply-demand balance for the forecasted projections of the equipment that they plan to build. And looking deeper at the component level, which materials are going to present challenges, which create risks for your company. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Of course, critical minerals is a real hot topic today, both the US-Ukraine negotiations and especially China using its dominance in that supply chain to get leverage in trade negotiations with the US. Now, there are calls for the US to start producing more, but creating a new mine is a 20 or 30-year process. That's a generational project. The near-term opportunities here are in waste valorization and circularity. There are a lot of startups that are looking at this, finding ways to extract high-value metals and minerals from, for example, mine tailings, or from industrial byproducts, even coal fly ash. There, we see an opportunity to invest and partner with technologies that are at TRL 6 to 8 and could quickly go from pilot stage to commercial stage in the near term. When we think about building new factories and facilities, of course, AI comes to mind, especially in automation. Lux has done quite a lot of coverage on industrial robotics, cobots, even humanoid robots, and that's certainly part of it. These new foundational models for robotic software will be a part of this next wave of infrastructure. But I think there's also an interesting opportunity here for a little bit more low-hanging fruit, using generative AI for upskilling human labor. And often one of the challenges in setting up a new facility in a location will be recruiting and training workers quickly. There are tools that can put a knowledge library at employees' fingertips so that you can get a facility up and running that much sooner. And there's a lower hiring bar so that low-skilled labor can quickly become trained and effective in the factory setting. Looking at the long term for industrials, I'd like to draw on two themes again here, and that's decarbonization and flexible manufacturing. So building on the themes that Chris raised, the train has really left the station when it comes to sustainability and decarbonization. But even though it's clear that, especially in the United States right now, sustainability is at a low tide, that tide will come back. And so a lot of innovators are sort of sitting on their hands and waiting for a little bit more clarity in the near term. But that means you can reallocate resources to those long-term projects, thinking about the really transformational impacts for new production platforms. How can you get to ultra-low carbon steel and cement in the 2030s and 2040s? We'll need to be investing now to advance electrochemical production and bio-based production in the case of cement and concrete. So this is a good time to be thinking about your long-term innovation roadmap and making sure that you're continuing to make progress on the transformational long-term projects. And then when I'm talking about flexible manufacturing, tariffs really are a kind of a location-specific business risk. So if you see a case now with the new tariffs that Trump has announced to onshore, you may find that in 2 years or 4 years, 5 years, that business case evaporates as the tariffs are renegotiated and we may return to a little bit more of a free trade situation, especially with close allies. Are there ways that you can be designing your equipment, your facilities in such a way that they can be easily disassembled and relocated? I was inspired by the idea of offshore floating power plants, which now exist. And could we have offshore floating factories that can move around to the best low-cost location and take advantage of the economic conditions and trade relations between countries? When historically factories have relocated, it's a very expensive and difficult process of packing up and shipping, moving equipment across a border. If you start designing for disassembly now and innovating on that, then you set yourself up really well to hedge risk for future economic moves. So I'll be keeping an eye on that as an important long-term initiative that companies can act on now. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Tiffany Hua to talk about the chemical sector. Tiffany?
Thanks, Ian. So for the chemicals industry, let's start off with near-term outlooks. So the good news is that most core chemicals and polymers have largely been spared from the tariffs that we've seen Ian talk about. And so core aromatic chemicals, naphtha, BTX, as well as polymers such as PET, they're going to have a level of protection from the reciprocal tariffs, and therefore the impact will really be downstream. And so for innovators and leaders, really focus on rerouting downstream supply chains, prioritizing regional diversity, and understanding your supply chain down to the finished goods. And so that means understanding your network of manufacturers, finishers, and then how it's really rerouting, into regions that, benefit, the bottom line. The second point here, with what we've seen from Trump's reeling back of, the federal budget, we are seeing R&D be impacted. And so that's going to impact academia. So any industry, academic, relationships that may be impacted, as well as industry government relationships in terms of R&D. And so this is where innovation groups are really going to have to be lean and also regionally diverse. And so you can see this, trend of rerouting and being regionally, diverse, and just being ready for what's to come in the next coming years as we see a innovation gap emerge. And so the last point here is also in regards to biomanufacturing. When we talk about far-looking innovations such as biomanufacturing, synthetic biology, the Trump administration has been sending some mixed signals. We've seen the Biden era advancing biotechnology and biomanufacturing innovation executive order from 2022 be revoked by Trump. And so with that, it's unclear, but what we've seen recently actually is a Senate proposed policy on biotechnology called the National Biotechnology Initiative Act of 2025. And so it's really unclear how this is going to proceed, but it's clear that there is a lot of unclarity. And so for innovators, it might be better to focus more on regions that are more friendly to biotechnology. So Asia Pacific might be an area that is more appealing in the near term. And we've seen also regions like Korea actually promote and incentivize synthetic biology. And then when we look at the long-term, outlook for chemicals, the thing is, you really have to align with what Trump is doing, but then also what is coming after Trump. So what we've seen specifically is momentum for PFAS, alternatives or phasing out of materials of concern globally. We've seen this in the EU, and then also in Asia, policy and regulation is picking up. And so even though we've seen Trump roll back some of these, let's say, effluent policies on PFAS in drinking water, there are still going to be, movements after Trump to regulate these materials. And so this is where innovators, you should still be developing alternatives that can really take advantage of what comes around post-Trump. The second point here is, we've heard from Chris about the, priorities of carbon capture. In the long term for chemicals, carbon capture utilization might come into play. And Trump has been pretty favorable of carbon capture sequestration via his 45Q tax credit. In the future, CCU, potentially via a Trump-endorsed, version of the IRA might come through, and so be ready to, take advantage of that if that does come through. And then lastly, Trump has been quite bullish on AI, and we've seen policies in his previous administration and then also guidelines for this current administration. And so look at where chemicals and AI really intersect. So that could be looking at material discovery platforms, material informatics, or potentially how AI, integrates with material marketplaces. things like that. And so potentially look out for potential incentives or how that aligns, or how AI and chemical aligns with, some of Trump's initiatives. And I will pass it to Josh for CPG.
Thanks, Tiff. So as we get into CPG, again, I'm going to start with the near-term outlook. So what can you do today that you should also be thinking about impact in the near term? And this all revolves around the U.S. narrowing its scope. The EPA, the USDA, these were organizations with really far-reaching impact. And what we've seen is some very particular decisions to align with the reduction in forest plans that are going on. So for agriculture, what does this look like? Overall, the USDA is reducing its investment in innovation as well as conservation projects. It's pulled out of some of its climate initiatives around precision agriculture, adjusting those more towards a market-focused perspective. And what does that mean? Well, that means the amount of enablement that's available, and USDA was a big portion of that, is no longer there. So this opens up opportunities in the short term for those with really strong agronomic capabilities that have been building those for now a long time through this digital agriculture trend we've had ongoing. You have an opportunity. There's a lot of companies out there that still want to address things like their sustainability in agriculture towards resilience and different outcomes. And now the USDA really isn't going to be as effective as a partner as it once was to do that. So that's number one. In addition, for agriculture, the U.S. clearly narrowed its scope on immigration. And so the immigration workforce that really drove a large portion of our agriculture ecosystem here is really at war with trust with the government. So even though there's been notions that the government may create visas after this initial round this year of reducing immigrant workforce, there may be a way back. The question is, will immigrants have trust for that and actually decide to work on those visas? Maybe not, but that maybe not creates an opportunity to be piloting automation systems. So whether they're cobots or fully automated systems, there's really going to be an opportunity in this next harvest season and coming through to apply those. So look for those opportunities in the short term for agriculture. Health is a bit of a different scenario. Clearly, there's a target agenda jeopardizing some supply chains. Right now, it seems like decisions are happening without a lot of input industry-wide. So we're seeing additives are likely going to be on the striking block, starting with flavoring ingredients. And we've already seen that take place now. Those impacts on flavoring ingredients, if you look at the initial revocations, aren't significant. They don't have really important issues in the supply chain. But if you look at the list as it goes down, there are others that are going to be important for colorants in particular. So be looking out for those. Anything that has an impact on potential children health is going to be on the chopping block. So really pay attention to that. And then lastly, do pay attention to reduction of force. You have an opportunity to scoop up a lot of really good employees right now, and don't dismiss that. I know economic times are difficult for hiring, but this is an opportunity absolutely to build your technical workforce up again. Now, as we look long term, it shifts a little bit, but overall the trend's the same. The U.S. is exiting a lot of different operations, and those are creating opportunities. However, I want to put a little fine touch on this, that with these different government assets exiting, creates opportunities, but it doesn't limit risk. And I think that's what we really need to remember. So if we think about agriculture, government has really moved towards a subsidization type of strategy, right? We're prioritizing subsidies over resilience. So this is a long-term opportunity, as it has always been, but we're shifting the mindset from regenerative to resilient, and those outcomes matter. And so products that help aid this are going to be extremely important, but take time to develop in the long term. And let's not forget that the impacts of the decisions the Trump administration has are going to be long-term as well. So resilience really aligns to this. So there's an opportunity created for industry players with experience here to continue to develop those products. But again, it's a long-term opportunity because this is a difficult thing to achieve. Health is something similar here. Here we're talking about chronic health. Right now, the administration says they're going to make an impact on chronic health in 2 years. The reality is this is highly unlikely, because in order to understand if you have an impact on chronic health, you have to measure things at the 5 and 10-year levels because you're looking at behavior changes. So we might get some early changes, but that's about it. So what do we really have here? Well, we have potentially a catalytic moment for investment in chronic health through the Trump administration. Ride that, look for early stage opportunities to push forward, but expect those returns to come after quite a long time. Now, in addition to this, we also have an alignment with chronic health on bringing in new ingredients. So the health restructuring is attracting some tax incentives, things like that for manufacturing. And we've already seen Roche consider investing $50 billion in the production of GLP-1s in the US. So for ingredients that are more difficult to manufacture, have higher standards of manufacturing, the US very well may be an area to invest, and a lot of those will align to chronic health. With that, I want to pass it back to Anthony to continue the discussion here and wrap us up.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks to all of my colleagues for presenting. There's a few, I think, themes, right, and points that I would make to anyone, regardless of sector. And first, it's that you really need to start preparing for regionalization, right? I think that the structure of corporate innovation has long been that the long-term or the transformative innovations are developed in a kind of corporate or central lab. And these are expected to serve global markets. And customer-centric innovation has been in regional labs. And I think now that type of approach is really going to struggle because the needs of the markets are going to diverge. And there may be barriers to using one technology platform for multiple regions. So you really need to start bringing that long-term innovation to those regional R&D hubs and really think seriously about developing different technology platforms for the different regions, understanding their needs and how their needs are going to evolve potentially away from the other regions. And China is a critical example of this, where the electric vehicle transition is happening much more rapidly in China. They're going to need different technology platforms in terms of batteries, materials, even electrical infrastructure, compared to somewhere like the US or the EU, where it's moving at a different pace. And I think you need to develop strategies to innovate in a recession. All of the economic uncertainty we've touched on, the potential disruptions, even just frankly the removal of funding, direct funding, pushes us closer to a recession, and one that will impact every country, in no small part because of tariffs. So you as innovators need to prepare to innovate in a recession. These tactics will help you, I think, no matter what the economic situation is. But whether that's building up alternative networks to help replace some of that government funding and also government strategic direction, whether it's incubators, consortia, networks across industry and with different industries, that's really crucial. And then finding ways to innovate more cheaply and measure ROI. We've done a number of webinars on this over the course of the year so far, most recently with my colleagues Naveen and Ari Van Berkel. Really working with founders can be an option, and just improving your ability to measure and capture value from innovation. All of that's going to be crucial. And so, looking back on what my colleagues had to say, I think a few final thoughts. One is that you should adjust tactics, but not necessarily strategy. Some of the biggest picture and longest term drivers are very much still in place. Things like sustainability, electrification, decarbonization. But you need to calibrate differently, focus on near-term impacts as opposed to these very sort of, big bets on things like, sustainable technologies that aren't going to pay off in the near term. Second, I would really highlight that capital light innovation is going to be key. Whether that is developing your relationships with founders, working to acquire talent that may have been displaced by some of Trump's changes to the academic sector, or even moving into new markets where you can pursue innovation, in just a more cost-effective way. This is going to be crucial. And I think for all the executives and the leaders out there, it's necessary to really position innovation teams as a response to uncertainty. And what I mean by that is, if innovation teams are just a long-term or a technology-focused cost center, it's going to be very easy to justify cutting them in a recession or in a downturn. But if innovation teams are providing an everyday function, right, something that allows companies to respond to uncertainty or shortages by enabling the replacement of critical minerals or alternative supply chains to be put in place or alternative manufacturing methods, these are not just a long-term cost center. It's something that really impacts the day-to-day operations, and that's the role that innovation teams are going to have to find for themselves over the next few years. So with that, I wanted to say thank you for, we'll now begin taking some questions. You can put them into the questions box. If we don't get into your question on the call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar, and I'll ask my colleagues to come back on camera and join me for the Q&A session. And while they're doing that, there's a number of questions here, more than a few on AI. AI has, of course, been probably the hottest topic. In particular, there's some questions around AI and data centers and what this means, for the development of those data center projects. We've seen some post-Trump projects like Stargate, which have been proposed. But Chris, I know your team has been thinking a lot about this question. Where do you see the development of data centers, whether it's for AI or a bit more generally? How do you see that progressing, now that we're 100 days into Trump's first term?
Yeah, the data center story has been, I would say, rapidly gaining momentum over the last maybe 18 to 24 months. I think this administration has been very clearly supportive of AI policies and supportive of building out of this infrastructure. So I think it's confident to say we'll see more data centers built. That will be a significant source of load growth. However, I would caution we're also seeing signs that some of the leases for different data centers have been canceled, that there's maybe a little bit of a slowdown, and I think it could look similar to the EV space, where EV sales continue to grow every year, but the growth rate is slowing, and as such, that's having impacts in the battery space. And I think we're going to see something similar with data centers, as the build out doesn't probably happen as quickly as many thought. At the same time, still a big opportunity for energy companies or even chemicals companies supplying cooling solutions to reduce energy consumption. That's going to be a big focus, or supply low carbon electrons.
So we have a number of questions here on tariffs as well. And I'm curious how tariffs intersect with data centers. If we have time, maybe we'll come back to that. Ian, though, you mentioned flexible manufacturing as an important part of the solution. But we didn't really get into nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. What are you thinking about those types of strategies in response to the tariffs and the general push for domestic supply chains?
Sure. Yeah, I think that although onshoring is clearly the central goal of Trump's tariffs here, that his idea is that this will be enough to push manufacturing back to the United States. Without a sense of durability to these tariffs, it's hard to make a strong business case for that type of major capital investment. And that's a theme that we talked through the middle section of the webinar. Moreover, we're also coming to appreciate how dense and specialized the manufacturing supply chains have become in China. And that's very hard to replicate without a supportive industrial policy. So I think for companies that are facing this choice of nearshoring, onshoring, we want to be looking beyond 1, 2, 4 years here and ensuring that there's the right business infrastructure that makes the case for a new facility that's going to be cost competitive, through this phase, because we just don't have enough conviction right now that these tariffs will last and support onshoring. So a lot of companies just waiting to see.
So I think that is all that we have time for today, unfortunately. With that, I want to say thank you, and that'll conclude our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. After you leave the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. So we'd appreciate your feedback. That really helps us develop and inform future webinars. And with that, I'd like to say thank you once again, and thank you to my colleagues for joining me today.